Well, welcome to Five Questions. Today we have Matt Dabbs with us, and uh, Matt's in Alabama and also works with wineskins and doing all the online content for wineskins. And so Matt's going to be talking to us today about discipleship. Before we get into that, tell us about yourself.
I grew up around St. Louis, Missouri, and my family was originally from North Alabama. So we moved there when I was about 12, went to Harding, and got a degree in psychology. Went to University of Florida to work on a doctorate in clinical psychology, and then withdrew after 9/11 to do an MDiv at Harding School of Theology now in Memphis. And then since then, I've worked in Florida, churches in Florida, California, and now here in Auburn, Alabama. And so I'm trying to get some focus in on discipleship. It's something that's been on my mind for a number of years. I'm kind of a little bit of an introvert, and I've kind of used that as an excuse for some time. And I knew it would kind of require some shifts, major shifts in my ministry and how I spend my time. And so um, this has really been the last year or so, a shift in focus and a shift in time more toward discipling. So I appreciate this conversation a lot.
Yeah, and you've already put some content out there. I know blogging on wineskins and some videos, and we'll try to link to all that so people can find more
Sure,
information
thank you.
that you shared. But let's begin with just the basic question: what is discipleship?
So when we think about discipleship, we think about being a learner, being an apprentice of Jesus. Sometimes that kind of gets mixed up when we hear that word discipleship. Maybe we think Crossroads or Boston, and we kind of get a little leery. But we're really thinking of Jesus as the master teacher. He's the one. It's the Jesus life, living the Jesus life, walking the Jesus journey. So even when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Follow me as I follow the example of Christ," sometimes that gets mixed up in discipling conversations. It's like the discipler becomes the person you're following. And I don't think it ever is intended that, but sometimes it kind of works out that way, and that's not a good biblical model. And so, another good word for it would be like an apprentice. When we say the word student, I think it kind of uh, in our culture today, we miss something with that word because we often think of sitting in a chair and regurgitating information, passing tests. This really is learning to do what Jesus did, to teach what Jesus taught. And so you watch like Mike Breen and some of his discipling material walks through kind of like that model that a lot of apprentice work does, where it's kind of like, the master does while you watch, and then, eventually you end up doing it while they're watching, and then you end up doing it without them. And you see that in the Gospels, like in Luke 9 and 10, when Jesus sends the 12 and the 72, and it says they preach the gospel of the kingdom, which is the exact same thing Jesus has been preaching, and they're casting out demons, healing diseases, which is the same thing Jesus has been doing. So a disciple ultimately is someone who is following Jesus with the intended purpose of becoming like him, which is called spiritual formation. We would get into Paul about having the mind of Christ, the attitude of Christ, the image of Christ, and etc. So we're becoming more like Jesus as we follow him and learn to do life Jesus' way. And so apprentice is a really good word for that. Um, and so we're listening to Jesus to hear what he said and to watch him to see what he did and do what he did. And obviously miracles and all that, we're not raising the dead today, but I think there's a lot of activity that Jesus did we can still mirror today, acts of compassion and mercy and kindness and love that Jesus showed to a lot of people, including the outcasts.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions, or maybe a question where there's some confusion, is how does discipleship differ from conversion or becoming a Christian?
Right. So it's entirely possible to be a convert but not be a disciple.
Mm,
It's not possible to be a disciple and not convert.
yeah.
Right. So I think that's an important distinction. If you do the discipleship piece, you always get conversion. If you just focus on conversion, you don't get discipleship. And so we've had kind of a lopsided view of the Great Commission because, and I know I've done this myself, is I'm going to it for a baptism verse to prove baptism, and I'm fine with what it says about baptism. I think that's great. I think it's accurate biblical that we would press baptism from the Great Commission there, Matthew 28, 19 and 20, but it's not the whole thing that he said. The whole thing that he said was, as you know, it was this. People watching this will know, therefore go and make disciples, almost like colon, here's how, by baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. So when we talk about conversion, I think sometimes we're talking about the 5 steps: to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. But you're not necessarily with those 5 things like getting someone that we're intentionally pointing toward and walking with toward Jesus in a discipling journey, a discipling process. So, and that may be kind of part of why a lot of our churches are sick or diminishing or in decline, because we really focused on conversion rather than discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've ended up with a lot of Christians, a lot of converts who don't really know the Jesus way of life well. And no one's ever I've asked this question in countless Bible classes among people from 20 to 90 years old. How many of you have been intentionally discipled? And I'll get, maybe 3 or 4% of people say, well, my parents kind of did. Maybe one person says, well, a youth minister kind of did. And I'm saying, well, no, I'm saying like someone came to you and said, like, let's do this journey together. Not just I kind of feel like I got it from here. I feel like I got a little from there, like an intentional discipling process. And nobody, I've had almost no one say that they've been through that, maybe 1 or 2 people. So that's an issue, I would say. And I think it's some of the problems we face today may come out of maybe symptomatic of that underlying issue.
Yeah, yeah, and that kind of leads to the next question I wanted to ask. Is so, it's possible, very likely, we have churches that no one's discipled in those churches, or if they are, it's a small minority. And so, why should churches be actively engaged in discipleship?
Well, the first thing I think that we have to do is re-normalize discipleship, because I think people have like a stigma to it again through the abuses of the past, through Crossroads in Boston. There's a real negative taste when you say that word. There's great suspicion. And what's unfortunate about that is it's such a biblical idea. And if you go to the New Testament and you go to Bible Gateway and you look up the word Christian. If you go to BibleGateway.com, type in Christian NIV, you're going to get seven occurrences. And I believe 4 of those are in headings, and then 3 of those like rules for Christian households or something like that, maybe in Ephesians 5. But you're only going to get 3 instances in the text. The reason I'm bringing this up is we need to normalize the idea of discipling. It's just been too abnormal. And so there are 300 instances of the word disciple, nearly 297 or something like that, in the New Testament. 100 times as many, okay?
Yeah.
And so we've banked everything on a word that can be nominal, like a word that I could take a survey. Are you a Buddhist, a Muslim, an atheist, or a Christian? I say, I'm a Christian. Why do you say that? Are you following Jesus? No, I go to church. Or I believe in the Jesus thing, but I'm not active. That, like you said, that question before, those 2 things are not necessarily one and the same, like to be a disciple and a Christian. And so we really have to come back to normalizing this idea of discipleship. And the 3 times that it occurs, one is it says they were called Christians first at Antioch. That says someone else was calling them that.
Yeah.
They seem to have accepted that, but it wasn't even an internal move. They're being called that. In 1 Peter, he says, if you suffer for being a Christian, which means people are labeling them Christians and persecuting them for this Jesus thing. Yeah. So that's another outside label. And the third one is when Paul is on trial. Is it Agrippa? I think maybe. I think it's Agrippa, maybe. I have to go back and look at that one. But he says, that's when he says, do you think you persuade me to be a Christian so quickly, And that's even antagonistic. So 1 Peter and Acts are antagonistic, and being called Christians at Antioch is neutral at best. And so, we have such a positive view of that term, and I don't have a problem with that term. It has meaning today. But the disciple term is a lot stronger term, and it's what's normal in the New Testament. So when you talk about a Jesus person, now this is very much absent in the letters of Paul. I'll throw that out up front. Paul doesn't use that word, but he talks an awful lot about following Jesus.
Yeah. And
so we really have to get back to this idea. And I love what N.T. Wright says, where he says, we don't stop taking $100 bills because there's a few fakes out there. I think that's such a good quote. It's like, does it get abused? Can it get abused? Yes. Should we stop doing it, not do it? No. If we're going to be biblical and biblically minded, I'll say this: if we're going to be obedient to Jesus, what did he say? Go and make disciples. It's so, and some people will say that was an instruction for them, not for us. And I don't find that to be a very good move. So your question was, why should we be engaged in this? First, to be obedient. I think second, to make this normal in our fellowship, because I think we'd be a lot healthier. And I think also we need to just really get back to this idea of like the priesthood of all believers, because the preacher cannot disciple 400 people.
Yeah.
And so the elders and the ministers and the members need to go back to 1 Peter 2:9. And, you know, the application I've seen of that verse in my lifetime has kind of been like an anti-Catholic polemic. We don't have priests. We're right because we don't have priests. But why don't we practice that? Like we professionalize ministry, and so we've allowed people to sit and give and say like they're supporting the ministry. But the Bible is like 1 Corinthians 12. There's one body, many parts, and we all have gifts, and we participate and celebrate and mourn with each other as a body, and that's when we're working at our best. So we would be healthier if we engaged in this. We would be obedient to Christ if we engaged in this, and I would say we would. This is hard to say, but we would be more biblical
Hmm.
if we did this. And I think that's such an important point because I think we have such a fertile starting point because we're people of the book typically, and we want to emulate what we see there. We'll even say we're the Church of Acts.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about that is if you read Acts, they took seriously what Jesus said in the Great Commission. It's a whole book about the Holy Spirit empowering them to make disciples.
Yeah.
And so to be that, we have to embrace this idea. And I think that's so vitally important. I think if we did, I think our churches would grow, whereas we're in quite a bit of a decline. I think it may come back to this.
Yeah. And you know, the next question I want to ask is what happens if we don't make disciples? And maybe we've already seen the answer to that question or seeing it now. But let's just think about the flip side, the negative side of that. When you don't do this, what happens?
I think we die a slow, agonizing death.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say this. That's really negative. I don't mean to sound that negative, but I mean just if you'll take that out where it goes, if you're not making disciples, and I think the average, here's why I say that. The average church is baptizing maybe 1%, 2% a year, if you look at their membership and their numbers. And when that person comes out of the water, there's typically no discipling process path available for that person. So they come down from the baptistry, we gather around, sing a song, give them a hug, and we pat them on the back and we say, I'm here for you. That's our discipling process, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you want me, I'm available.
Yeah.
That's just not biblical. We need to be walking with people and follow. But my point in that, to your question is what happens if we don't, is first of all, we're converting very few people.
Yeah.
And that's the conversion side. We're discipling even fewer, basically almost none. And so if we're converting 1% of our number every year, and more than 1% of our number are dying or moving or going to some other church or just giving up or whatever, we're going to really be in a bad way in 10 years. We already are in somewhat of a bad way on average, I would say. That's not everywhere. There's a lot of exceptions on that and a lot of sides. But we have to get back to this idea of like that Great Commission is for us, but a job that's for everyone is a job for no one, right? So the Great Commission is a job for me. And the Great Commission is a job for every priest of Christ, which is every Christian. And so I think we have to get back to that. And so if you take Jesus' instruction seriously in the Great Commission, he has a loop, right? Because he says, go make disciples, baptizing and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. If a disciple who is made is taught to obey everything Jesus commanded them, that disciple will obey the Great Commission because it's something Jesus taught them to teach the people they disciple.
Yeah.
And so you end up, Jesus, I think, in the Great Commission, in his divine knowledge, created an amazing cycle of disciples who make disciples, who make disciples, who make disciples. And somewhere along the line, we boiled it down to salvation. Let's get them saved, 5 steps, rather than let's make disciples. And we've stripped baptism out of there to make a perfectly biblical point. I'm on board.
Yeah.
But we've missed the bigger point, which was make a disciple. Here's what it looks like, baptizing and teaching. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think that we've probably seen examples of people who are Christian in name only. And so they've done something to embrace Christianity, where that's, a sinner's prayer, baptism, whatever. And then that's just kind of it,
Right.
And then the life and everything else doesn't look Christian at all, Maybe
Well,
there's.
part of it, I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I think part of it goes back to a lot of our discussion came to like, um, how to convert people. I mean, that really was a big part. My impression, and I grew up in the 80s, but the 50s, 60s, and beyond after World War II was a real push for evangelism, a push for conversion. And I think that's good. I think that's admirable. But I think we got really good at the conversion discussion. Like, how can I convince you that you are lost and in sin and that you need Jesus and salvation? And so I have my verses. I think we got really good at that conversation. But what we end up with is like what I think it was Dallas Willard called vampire Christians. It's like we just need Jesus for his blood.
Yeah.
And that's really unfortunate. Like, we need Jesus for life to the full. And part of life to the full, life abundant, as he promises us that if we follow him, we'll have life to the full, is the discipleship life. Like, we put it this way, life as a convert is not the same as life as a disciple. And life as a disciple, as in I'm following Jesus to learn his ways and to do his ways in the world, to practice his ways, his life, his teaching, to teach others his teaching, because I'm a disciple who makes disciples by passing on the teaching and baptizing. That is a full life. I would really say, like, if we sell people on just conversion alone, we're not really presenting to them the full life in Christ of what that really looks like to walk alongside Jesus in this life. And it's really a sad thing. We kind of get them in the water and then we kind of leave them be. I think we hope our discipling process is through Bible class. If they will just show up in attend class, they would be discipled. And it just never works well.
Yeah, especially when a lot of churches, and not all of them, but there's a lot that just offer this sort of lecture auditorium class where I think it's really impossible to disciple anyone in that type of Bible class, especially.
Exactly. And so, again, go to the second part of discipleship. The first part being a disciple follows Jesus to hear what he says, to watch what he does. We could say, well, in Bible class, you can hear what he said and kind of watch through the word what he was doing. But the second half of that is where the real growth comes, which is go do what he did and say what he said, teach what he taught, do what he did.
Yeah.
And so when we rely on Bible class, we're only getting that first part if we're even in the Gospels. We might be on a random book or something. We're teaching Jude because why? Because we've never taught Jude here before. Okay, well, is that purposeful? Is that intentional? Does that help advance people toward being a better disciple? We can teach Jude perfectly well in a way that helps people follow Jesus better. So, we need those kind of filters and parameters, intentionality with what we're doing. But I think we really shortchange people if we don't offer them outlets to identify their gifts and entrust and empower them to live out the Jesus life in ministry. But too often, again, we're 80-20 with 80%, 20% doing 80% of the work. But I think we've encouraged that. We complain about it, but I think we've encouraged it in many ways. And I think that's unfortunate. We professionalize too many things. And so even with our youth ministry, and this is not a picking on youth ministers at all. I have had great ones and I support them. I think it's more of a parent issue than a youth minister issue, is we've so professionalized ministry that parents don't think they have what it takes to disciple their own kid. So they drop them off at youth group and think they're being discipled. But a youth minister can't disciple 40 kids.
Okay, there may be some people watching today, perhaps some church leaders, ministers, elders, and they're on board with what you're saying. And they want to start, but they might not know where to begin. And so how can a church begin to make disciples? What are some of the first steps they need to take?
So I got a call probably about a month ago from an elder and who I've never met. And he was looking through some of the things that we've been discussing online. And he had told a story about how he had really been convicted a couple of years ago to disciple people. And our typical thought is, well, we need to take a message, we need to give it to the church, we need to get buy-in, and get so many people on board, and then launch a ministry or something. And he said what he did was and this is no prescription, mind you, like what I'm saying here. I just want to illustrate through a story. He went before the church. He was so convicted, like that he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing, that he went before the church as an elder and repented for not making disciples. And his words are what I really want to point to more than saying, I'm not saying all elders need to go forward and repent. Okay? I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But what he said when he got up there was just almost brought me to tears when he said it. And that doesn't happen to me much. I'm not very emotional. Was he said that I'm going to promise you as an elder of this church that there will be disciples made in this church. And the reason I'm going to promise you that is because I'm going to do it myself. I was like, oh, well, that's not how we normally talk.
Yeah.
And he had just such conviction. Like, he's like, the buck stops here. I'm going to take it. I'm going to do it. And if no one else wants to do it, I don't care. I'm going to go do what I was called to do, and that's all I can do. And I mean, you can bet people will follow that. And so I really think it has to start at the top. I really think that, and part of it is as ministers, I would love to hear people, if someone's watching this, and maybe hear some thoughts on those who are watching who are ministers. How many of us have ever had in our job description spend time discipling people?
Yeah.
It would change the culture of the church if the elders and the ministers would do this, because what typically happens is we say, well, we need to be making disciples. The Bible says it, let's do it. So we're going to start a new ministry, or we're going to do a sermon series on it, or we're going to start a Bible class on it. And then several years later, we're like, hey, what happened with that discipleship thing? We're like, yeah, we did that in 2019 in the fall. And, we're moving on to something else.
Yeah.
Like, no, that's not it.
Yeah.
I mean, how many years does the book of Acts encompass? And they're still making disciples, and the church grows exponentially for several hundred years or beyond, even to today, in this discipling idea. So I think it starts at the top. I think elders and ministers need to spend time doing this, and this is something I'm spending more of my time doing. I think they need to spend more time doing this. And that may mean that the minister needs some things taken off their plate to free up some time to do this, or at least rework some time and have the flexibility to do that. The elders, I think, need to be spending time making disciples, because you can preach and teach all you want and try to change a culture, but if people don't see the elders and ministers doing this, they're not going to buy in very well.
Yeah.
And I think secondly, we would start. Well, I wouldn't say start. You start with the people who you feel like you could actually do this with. But I think it's really important that we start discipling the people who are being baptized. That when they come out of that water, that we have developed, we have sat down as a leadership and prayed through, like, what are clear steps to help move them toward Jesus, who's going to partner with them, who is in the best position to walk with them. Gender should be considered in that. I don't think you should have men and women kind of mixing up on this discipling thing. I think that's a recipe for problems. Some guy needs to walk alongside that newly baptized young man or older man or however old, and same with the ladies. Young lady or an older lady needs to walk alongside. They need to have someone who is further along in the faith walking alongside them when they're baptized. Like, everyone knows, like, this is the next step. This is what we do. We need clear processes, procedures, and steps on, like, what this looks like, what's expected on that ongoing relationship, that discipling relationship. I think that's very, very important. And so for the rest of the people in the church, if you're a minister and elder, I've already addressed that. When someone's newly baptized, we need to be on that. And I will say that may be a slow start, because most churches are not baptizing a lot of people.
Yeah.
But we got to back up and say, like, we're not just trying to baptize people. We are looking at the non-Christians around us, saying, like, reaching them is discipling. Like, when we think about discipleship, there's two parts. One is, like, walking alongside an already Christian, but to make disciples is evangelism, right?
Yeah.
So we need to look around and say, like, who could I disciple in an evangelistic sense, and who can I disciple from an in-house perspective, someone who's already been converted, and basically to look around and it's a little bit of a touchy process, because if the one who is older and more mature approaches someone who is less mature in their faith, first of all, you're making assumptions about maturity levels. But second, the person who's receiving that may not get that invitation from the person who they want to do it, right? So that could be awkward if they're like, oh, I really hope brother so-and-so wouldn't ask to do this with me, So I think it's helpful if the person who is younger in their faith can start thinking more about, like, who is it in my life who I love, respect, and trust, who I could ask to walk alongside me in this, so they're entirely comfortable with it.
Yeah.
I think that's a better direction than the older people assuming, like, I can step in and do this, and maybe they're not welcome into that. And I will say that shouldn't be your very first conversation with somebody is, hey, I know we've never talked before, but can I disciple you?
Yeah.
We need to be in relationship here if we're not. And so maybe that's where some people start is, I don't know people well enough to be in this relationship. Well, let's not make that the case 2 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great stuff. Are there any resources that you would recommend? Is there anything good out there that people could pick up and would help out with this?
Sure. So, 3DM Mike Breen is extremely good. Multiplying Missional Leaders. He has two or three extremely good books on discipling. Um, Renew out of Nashville, Bobby Harrington's group is excellent. They have a lot of good online resources. They're on Instagram. Um, they put out a lot of good books they're publishing, and they partner with a lot of good people. And so Bobby Harrington is a Christian church guy out of Nashville, and he's been doing discipleship for decades, and he's really a great guy doing great work. And they're partnering internationally with doing discipling in Africa and other places, and really doing a great job. But those are the two things that come to mind when you ask that question. I mean, I'm starting to work on some things myself and develop some things, and get on Facebook, just a discipling group with some online conversation going, and just trying to spur those conversations and like encourage people on to step into that and do that, because I'm really convinced that this is vital to the future of our congregations. If we don't make that step, I think that's kind of a little bit of why we're in some of the trouble that we're in, just looking at the numbers and looking at where it's at. And it's like crazy as you keep doing the same thing, expect a different result. So it's
Yeah.
concerning to me. If we can't turn that corner, I'm a little bit concerned. And God's going to take care of his people. I mean, his church there'll always be people, and God's got this. But he's called us to do this.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
well
we need to be obedient.
I think you are spurring those discussions, and that's why I asked you on here today. And I appreciate the stuff that you've been doing, and I appreciate you thinking deeply about this, and would encourage people to go to Wineskins and especially look at your discipleship stuff, but look at the other stuff there and some of your videos and everything. And of course, I'm going to throw some links up in the comments section so people can easily connect with that. But thanks, Matt, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it.